Thomas Harwood sat alone in his cramped university office, surrounded by towers of philosophical texts and half-finished manuscripts. At 42, he was considered brilliant but difficult. A professor whose work on German philosophy had earned him respect but few friends. The afternoon light cast long shadows across his desk as he thumbed through his worn copy of Schopenhauer's essays. A knock interrupted his concentration. Catherine, his wife of 15 years, stood in the doorway. "You missed dinner again?" she said, her voice tired but not accusatory. The children waited. Thomas closed his book with a sigh. "I'm sorry, I lost track of time. This paper on Schopenhauer's metaphysics is due next week." "I know." Catherine leaned against the doorframe. "We haven't seen you for more than 10 minutes at a time in days." Thomas removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I need to finish this. It could secure my position for the philosophy chair." "Everything always has to give way to your work," Catherine said quietly. "Sometimes I wonder if you remember there's a world outside these books." After she left, Thomas stared at Schopenhauer's words on the page. "Man strives in everything for a direct domination over things, either by comprehending or by subduing them. Woman strives for a domination over man." He wondered, not for the first time, if his marriage was becoming the very impediment to greatness that his philosophical hero had warned about. Marcus Bennett, Thomas's most promising doctoral student, sat across from him in the university cafe. Brilliant and ambitious, Marcus reminded Thomas of himself 15 years ago. Before marriage, before children, before compromise. "I've been reading your work on Schopenhauer's concept of the will," Marcus said, stirring his coffee. "His views on women are controversial, but there's something compelling about his argument that domestic life diverts male energy from higher intellectual pursuits." Thomas glanced around to ensure no one was listening. Schopenhauer wasn't entirely wrong. The demands of family life do consume time and energy that might otherwise be directed toward scholarship. "Is that why your output has slowed in recent years?" Marcus asked, his question innocent but piercing. Thomas felt a flash of irritation, followed by uncomfortable recognition. "We all make choices," he said finally. "Some lead to greatness, others to contentment." Later that evening, Thomas found himself unable to work, Marcus's question echoing in his mind. Was Catherine, loving, patient Catherine, the reason he hadn't achieved the academic prominence he'd once seemed destined for? The department's annual reception buzzed with academic politics and pretension. Thomas stood near the bar, nursing a scotch and observing his colleagues with detached amusement. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," said Eleanor Winters, the department's newest hire, young, unmarried, and already publishing in journals that had repeatedly rejected Thomas's work. "Academic socializing isn't my strong suit," Thomas admitted, "yet Schopenhauer would say it's necessary for advancement," Eleanor replied with a knowing smile. "Though he'd also say your marriage is what's really holding you back." Thomas stiffened. "You've read my work." "And Schopenhauer's. His misogyny is indefensible, but his observations about how domestic responsibilities can consume creative energy aren't entirely without merit." She sipped her wine. "Though I'd argue they apply equally to women academics." Their conversation was interrupted by Catherine's arrival. Thomas watched as his wife navigated the room with ease, charming his colleagues in ways he never could. He felt a complex emotion rise within him. Pride in her social grace, resentment at her comfort in a world where he felt perpetually awkward, and a nagging suspicion that Schopenhauer's ghost was whispering uncomfortable truths in his ear. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning. The philosophy department would be appointing a new chair, and both Thomas and Eleanor were shortlisted candidates. The position represented everything Thomas had worked toward: prestige, reduced teaching loads, increased research funding. "Congratulations," Catherine said when he told her the news. "This is what you've wanted." "It's what I deserve," Thomas replied, more sharply than he intended. "I've sacrificed enough for it." Catherine's expression hardened slightly. "We all have, Thomas." That night, unable to sleep, Thomas found himself in his study reading Schopenhauer's words. "Marriage is a trap which nature sets for us." He thought of Eleanor, unencumbered, focused, rapidly ascending in their field. No children demanding attention, no spouse requiring emotional energy. The next morning, Thomas informed Catherine he would be sleeping in his campus office for the foreseeable future. "Just until the chair decision is made," he explained. "I need to focus completely on my work." Catherine's eyes registered hurt, but she nodded. "If that's what you think is necessary." Thomas's temporary office residence stretched from days into weeks. He worked with fevered intensity, producing more scholarship in a month than he had in the previous year. His new paper on Schopenhauer's Metaphysics of the Will was accepted by a prestigious journal. His lectures grew more incisive, drawing larger audiences. Marcus visited often, bringing food and coffee, eager to discuss philosophy late into the night. "You seem different," he observed one evening. "More alive." "I feel clearer," Thomas admitted, "focused in a way I haven't been in years." He called home daily, brief conversations with Catherine and the children that left him feeling both guilty and relieved when they ended. One evening, Catherine's voice sounded different, lighter somehow. "I've started painting again," she told him. "Just small watercolors, but it feels good to create something of my own." Thomas felt an unexpected bang! Catherine had been an artist when they met, talented enough that her professors had encouraged her toward graduate studies. She had set it aside when their first child was born. "That's good," he said, unsure why her renewal of an old passion disturbed him so deeply. Marcus appeared at Thomas's office door looking troubled. "I need to tell you something," he said, refusing Thomas's offer of a chair. "Eleanor's paper on phenomenology and gender, it's brilliant. It's being discussed everywhere, even outside philosophy circles." He hesitated. "People are saying it could secure her the chair position." Thomas dismissed the concern with a wave. "The chair isn't decided by public attention. It's about consistent scholarly contribution." "Maybe," Marcus said, unconvinced, "but there's something else. Catherine came to campus yesterday. She and Eleanor had lunch together." Thomas felt a cold sensation spread through his chest. "What? Why?" "I don't know," Marcus replied. "But they seemed, friendly." After Marcus left, Thomas paced his small office, Schopenhauer's words ringing in his ears. "Women are directly fitted for acting as the nurses and teachers of our early childhood, by the fact that they are themselves childish, frivolous, and short-sighted." Was Catherine undermining him, forming alliances with his competitor? For the first time in weeks, Thomas drove home. The house was quiet when Thomas arrived. Catherine sat in the garden, a half-finished watercolor on the easel before her. She didn't seem surprised to see him. "You had lunch with Eleanor Winters," he said without preamble. Catherine set down her brush. "Yes, she contacted me about the department's spouse support group. I've been thinking of joining." "Support for what?" Thomas demanded. "For being married to academics," Catherine replied evenly. "People who often forget the world doesn't revolve around their research." Thomas felt his anger rise. "Is that what you discuss? How difficult your husbands are." "We discuss how to maintain our own identities while supporting partners who are often too absorbed in their work to notice us fading away." Catherine's voice remained calm, but her eyes were hard. "Eleanor's mother was married to a philosophy professor. She saw what happened to her." "And what exactly happened to her?" Thomas asked, his tone bitter. "She disappeared," Catherine said simply, "became a footnote in her husband's biography. Eleanor wants to understand how academic partnerships can be more equal." Thomas laughed harshly. "Equal? Schopenhauer would say I don't care what Schopenhauer would say, Catherine interrupted, her composure finally breaking. He was a misogynist who never maintained a successful relationship in his life. Is that your model, Thomas? A lonely man who died surrounded by books instead of people who loved him. Thomas retreated to his campus office, Catherine's words haunting him. He pulled out his well-worn copy of Schopenhauer, seeking comfort in familiar philosophy, but instead found himself reading with new eyes. A knock at the door revealed Eleanor. "I thought I might find you here," she said. "Catherine called. She's worried about you." Thomas gestured for her to enter. "Are you here to gloat? Your paper is being called groundbreaking. The chair is probably yours." Eleanor sat across from him. "I didn't come to talk about the chair. I came to talk about Schopenhauer and you." "What about me?" "You've built your career interpreting a philosopher who argued that women hinder male greatness, yet you seem blind to the irony of your situation." Thomas bristled. "Which is?" "That you're using Catherine as a scapegoat for your own limitations," Eleanor said bluntly. "Schopenhauer's views on women weren't philosophy. They were biography, justifications for his own failures at human connection." "That's reductive," Thomas protested. "Is it? My paper argues that Schopenhauer's misogyny wasn't incidental to his philosophy. It was foundational. His metaphysics of will requires a hierarchical view of gender to function." Eleanor leaned forward. "And you've been so busy defending him that you've adopted his blindness." "What blindness?" "To the possibility that greatness isn't achieved in isolation, that connection might enable rather than hinder it." After she left, Thomas sat motionless, confronting the uncomfortable possibility that his intellectual hero, and by extension, himself, might be fundamentally wrong. Thomas spent the night reading Eleanor's paper, recognizing with growing unease the brilliance of her analysis. She had done what he had never dared, questioned Schopenhauer's premises rather than simply interpreting them. Morning found him driving home, feeling strangely lighter despite his sleepless night. The house was quiet. Catherine had taken the children to her mother's for the weekend. Thomas wandered through the rooms, seeing evidence of his family's life together. Catherine's paintings had multiplied during his absence, small bursts of color and life throughout the house. On her desk lay sketches for what appeared to be a children's book illustration project. He found himself in his home office, dusty from disuse. On the desk sat a stack of his own published papers, organized, annotated in Catherine's handwriting. She had been reading his work, engaging with it in ways he had never bothered to notice. Next to the papers lay a book he didn't recognize. Opening it, he discovered it was Eleanor's doctoral dissertation from years earlier. On the acknowledgements page, she had thanked Thomas Harwood for conversations that clarified my thinking and challenged my assumptions. Thomas sat heavily in his chair, realizing how little he knew about his wife's intellectual life, a life that had apparently continued alongside his own, invisible to him because he had never bothered to look. The philosophy department gathered. For the chair announcement, Thomas sat next to Marcus, feeling strangely calm despite the stakes. "Whatever happens," Thomas said quietly, "I've decided to spend more time at home." Marcus looked surprised. "But your work will continue." "Thomas, you finished, but perhaps in dialogue rather than isolation." The dean stood at the podium. "After careful consideration, we are pleased to announce that the new chair of philosophy will be Professor Thomas Harwood." The room applauded. Eleanor, seated across the aisle, gave Thomas a small nod that contained neither resentment nor surprise. Later, at the reception, she approached him. "Congratulations. Thank you. Your paper was remarkable. It should have been enough." Eleanor smiled. "Perhaps in time it will be. Academia changes slowly, like all institutions." I'd like to organize a symposium on contemporary interpretations of Schopenhauer, Thomas said, including feminist critiques. Would you be interested in participating? I would, Eleanor replied, and I believe Catherine might have contributions to make as well. Thomas looked at her sharply. Catherine isn't a philosopher. No, Eleanor agreed, but she has insights that might surprise you. Sometimes the most profound philosophical challenges come from outside the discipline. Thomas returned home to find Catherine in the spare room she had converted to a studio. Canvases leaned against every wall, landscapes, abstracts, and a series of illustrations depicting philosophical concepts in visual form. These are extraordinary, Thomas said, genuinely impressed. Catherine looked up from her work. Thank you. I've had a lot of time to paint lately. I want to apologize, Thomas began. Catherine shook her head. Not yet. First, I want you to see something. She led him to a canvas covered with a cloth. When she unveiled it, Thomas found himself looking at a painting inspired by Schopenhauer's concept of the will, but reimagined. Where Schopenhauer had envisioned the will as a driving masculine force, Catherine had depicted it as an interconnected web, neither masculine nor feminine, but universal. This is how I see it, she said simply. Not as a force that drives us toward individual greatness, but as the connections that enable collective understanding. Thomas stared at the painting, seeing his life's philosophical work transformed through his wife's eyes. How long have you been engaging with these ideas? Since we met, Catherine replied. I read everything you wrote. I just stopped talking about it when I realized you weren't interested in my perspective. The realization struck Thomas with physical force. He had been living with a mind as engaged with philosophical questions as his own, but had dismissed her insights because they came from outside his academic realm. The Schopenhauer Symposium drew scholars from across the country. As department chair, Thomas opened the proceedings with a statement that surprised the audience. For too long, we have treated philosophy as a solitary pursuit, the product of great men thinking alone. But true philosophical insight doesn't emerge in isolation. It arises from dialogue, from challenge, from the friction of minds in contact. The day's presentations included Eleanor's groundbreaking feminist critique, Marcus's analysis of Schopenhauer's aesthetics, and a panel discussion on the philosopher's continuing relevance. The final presentation was listed simply as Visual Interpretations of Schopenhauer's Will by Catherine Harwood. When Catherine took the podium, Thomas watched his colleagues' reactions, initial skepticism giving way to genuine engagement as she unveiled her series of paintings and explained her visual reinterpretation of Schopenhauer's central concept. The will, as I understand it, is not a force that drives us toward individual achievement at the expense of connection, she explained. Rather, it's the underlying reality that connects all beings, a recognition that might lead not to isolation in the pursuit of greatness, but to collaboration in the pursuit of understanding. Thomas watched as his academic peers engaged with his wife's ideas with the same seriousness they would afford any colleague. He felt a strange mixture of pride, shame, and revelation washing over him. 6 months after the symposium, Thomas sat at his desk at home, no longer sleeping at the office, no longer hiding from the supposed distractions of family life. Before him lay the manuscript of his new book, Beyond the Individual Will, Rethinking Schopenhauer's Legacy. Catherine entered with 2 cups of coffee. How's it coming? I finished the chapter responding to Eleanor's critique, Thomas said. I'm still struggling with the conclusion. Catherine sat beside him. What's troubling you? I've spent my career defending a philosopher who was fundamentally wrong about half of humanity, Thomas admitted. I'm not sure how to reconcile that. Perhaps you don't need to reconcile it. Catherine suggested. Perhaps you need to move beyond it, to develop a philosophy that acknowledges what Schopenhauer could not, that greatness doesn't require isolation or domination. Thomas looked at his wife with new eyes. Would you consider co-authoring the final chapter? Your perspective on the will as connection rather than dominance? It changes everything. Catherine smiled. I thought you'd never ask. 5 years later, Thomas stood at the back of a crowded lecture hall as Catherine delivered the keynote address at the International Schopenhauer Society Conference. Their co-authored book had sparked a reconsideration of the philosopher's legacy, particularly his views on gender and creativity. Eleanor, now chair of a different university's philosophy department, sat in the front row. Marcus, recently tenured, took notes furiously as Catherine spoke. Schopenhauer believed that women hindered male greatness, Catherine was saying. But what if greatness itself has been misconceived? What if the highest achievement isn't individual recognition, but collective advancement of understanding? Thomas felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to find his teenage daughter Julia. Dad, I read your and Mum's book last night, she whispered. Thomas raised an eyebrow. The whole thing? It's rather dense, Julia shrugged. The parts about how isolation isn't necessary for achievement made sense to me. I've been thinking about my science project. I might need collaborators after all. As Thomas watched his wife eloquently challenging centuries of philosophical tradition, his daughter beside him already thinking beyond those challenges, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Schopenhauer had been wrong. His greatness hadn't been hindered by his connection to Catherine. It had been made possible by it, not the solitary greatness of academic recognition, but something richer and more enduring, the greatness of ideas evolving through genuine dialogue, of perspectives widened through intimate challenge, of a legacy that would continue through his children and students. In the end, it wasn't Catherine who had hindered Thomas's greatness. It was Schopenhauer's ghost, finally exorcised, who had nearly prevented him from discovering what true greatness might be.